Good afternoon. We are tremendously fortunate to have with us today the man who in 2001 was voted the greatest editor in British history. And rightly so. Editor of the Sunday Times, editor of the Times, known for his fearlessness as a journalist, but also for his commitment to clarity in language. And it's about that we're going to speak today. He has written this totally magnificent book, Do I Make Myself Clear? I want to make this book clear here, which explains the genesis of bad and unclear language and what to do about it. The rest of us can complain about the English language, but actually Harry's doing something about it and the way it's moving forward. And so I would like to ask him a series of questions. He's also got some slides here. The first one, he starts with a quotation from Winston Churchill, which I'm very pleased about. And
by the way, read his review in the Daily Telegraph today on Winston Churchill. He speaks with reasonable authority. So I am not going to challenge anything he says on Churchill. Right?
Thank you.
Except one sentence.
Well, why don't you read this
the point
bit where he starts the book?
Grew up, I heard Churchill on the radio, and I have the significance of being old enough to have been bombed by Hitler. I don't think there's anybody else in the room who had that experience. So he will give me the privilege of saying to be bombed by Hitler.
Couple.
Really? Just keep it to yourself.
Gentlemen,
to be bombed by Hitler. Thank you. Keep it. Very good. We'll have a club.
Don't underestimate the average age of this audience.
To be bombed by Hitler and orated to by Winston Churchill is a singular privilege. And I will never forget Winston Churchill. But when I came to read his books, My Early Life, which Andrew covers, is such a funny, brilliant book. When I became editor of the Northern Echo in Darlington, I wrote to Winston. And I said, "Dear Mr. Churchill, I would like to turn My Early Life into a comic strip." What? I expected to get a thunder blast from Downing Street. And what I got was the most charming letter, say, "Please go ahead." So I got an artist in Darlington to turn My Early Life into a comic strip, which is still in the Northern Echo. And out of my admiration for Churchill, when I wasn't cowardly hiding in an air raid shelter in Manchester, one of the things I noticed was that Winston had a problem. Some of you may have a problem. He had a problem talking to a table. Do you have a problem talking to a table? No, you have to speak in the Latin. You have to regard the table as mensa. And to address the table in the vocative voice, which he wanted to do, requires you to say, "O mensa." So he said, "What is this rigmarole of O mensa?" And he got very irritated with it. And he said, "I'm going to dedicate myself," this is Winston, "to write in Anglo-Saxon English, which is a noble thing." And what is wonderful about Winston Churchill, I just want to read you, in 1941, when Britain was all alone and Pearl Harbor had just taken place. And Winston Churchill wanted to appeal to the Americans who did not enter the war until Hitler declared war on the Negrified, Jewish-sized America. We forget that in America. It was Hitler who declared war on Nazis. And so Britain was in desperate straits, needing food and supplies crossing the Atlantic. And so Winston addressed a letter to Franklin Roosevelt, and there's several books on this thing. And one of the things which I want to draw attention to is that the speech goes like this: "We shall not fail or falter. We shall not weaken or tire. Neither sudden shock of battle nor the long-drawn trials of vigilance and exertion will wear us down." Great. But then, listen to this. You probably know it. But then he condensed his message into 10 taught words in the active voice. Give us the tools and we'll finish the job. Perfect English, active voice, vigorous, short words. I mean, if he'd been an American, he would have said, donate us the implements and we'll finalize the assignment. but having the noble spirit of Anglo-Saxon in his blood, he said, he didn't whine or moan, he just said, give us the tools, man, and we'll finish the job. So that struck me as a young, relatively young, I was relatively young once, struck me as a message to all of us, if we could get into our spirits the noble thing of the Anglo-Saxon language and rid it, forgive me, every Latin scholar in the room, drive ourselves by the original English, we will be much clearer. But today, English is in huge difficulty.
But you, nonetheless, tell us in this book how to get out of those difficulties. And in particular, you have created some forms, some defence mechanisms. And I'd like to ask you about some of them. The first is, if I pronounce this right, fagi ausum.
Well, that's Latin, of course. I didn't do Latin, by the way, which is why I didn't go to Oxford like my wife, who I hope is somewhere in the room cringing.
There she is.
So I went to Durham. But the point about, is Fagi is an aquatic creature that eats words. It's an aquatic creature, and I christened it with the sequence awesome. So Fagi awesome is a word eater, a flesh eater. And in my book, you all employ flesh eaters. So I ask you to consider the flesh eaters you use when you write. Because when I write, I go through and try and identify the flesh eaters. And there are so many of them. I mean, he succumbed to his injuries. He died, right? They made good their escape. They escaped. We keep putting these flesh-eating words in, in all the circumstances, despite the fact that, now, I'm all for brevity, but there's brevity which we can get here is by sticking to the meaning of the words, not simply by embroidering them and letting flesh eaters get to them. And one of the things I would like to do is just show you one of the things I want to start with doing, Andrew, begging any teacher in the room, I want to apologize straight away, humbly saying that don't ram grammar down the throats of your pupils. It doesn't really matter. That, which, will, etc., shall, I shall drown and nobody will save me. The important thing is not to get intimidated by grammar. Having editing for hundreds of years, the most pathetic sight of writers coming to me, I'm not sure of the grammar. And to my reporters or feature writers, when I was president of Random House Book Company, dealing with people like Norman Baylor, he never said that. What I said to people, I said, I don't think I've got the grammar right. I said, get the meaning clear. As long as you get the meaning clear, I don't care if you get that mixed up with will and whom with whom. So I wanted to show you a few things on this. Those of you who can see it, if you can. Yeah, I was to point out at the beginning that there's fog everywhere in the language. I mean, I was reading a very good newspaper, the Financial Times, which talks about the measurability of learning outcomes. What? And there was another one here, which I've got down. It says, improve the efficacy of measurable learning curves. Staff is urged to deliver social listening tools, to come up with some consumer engagement strategy, to inspire conversation and conversations generally, and advocacy. By the time you've gone through garbage like this, I've got so many examples in the book, I became completely obese with this flatulence, which is everywhere. So you cannot escape it. I was talking to a social entrepreneur the other day. He said, I'm going to attend a liquidation event. I said, that's interesting. Is it Scotch? He said, no, a liquidation event is a sale. I said, why don't you say sale? Well, he said, liquidation event sounds better. Well, you know, Miss Kellaway in the Financial Times is a very good detective of this kind of stuff, this garbage, as I call it. And so fog everywhere, fog online and in print, fog in, this is fog in New York, but you have it in London occasionally. And so what I'm suggesting is to make oneself clear. And here's an example in grammar. It's a man escaping the assay gaze of a pursuing tribe, and he said, all right then, it is I, it is I. He's terrified of not saying, it is me, it is me, it is me. So this is one thing I don't want to be scared of grammar. If you're pursued by hostile people, be happy to say, it's me, which is this from the New Yorker cartoon. Here's another one. And remember, he's leaving prison. And remember, no more subjunctives when the correct mood is indicative. Oh, I remember that, Governor. Yeah. And here's another one. Sorry, I'm going to have to issue a summons for reckless grammar and driving without an apostrophe. Now, this is when it gets really important. I want you to read that. I'm going to read it aloud to you, and I want you to turn on the genius part of your brain and tell me what it means. This is a question in the Colorado 2016 vote on a referendum. So 2 million Colorado voters had this on their referendums. Much simpler than Brexit, okay? Shall there be an amendment to the Colorado Constitution concerning the removal of the exception to the prohibition of slavery and involuntary servitude when used as punishment for persons duly convicted of a crime? What does it mean? I asked the distinguished editor of the New Yorker what it meant, and he retired to a room for 15 minutes and came out and told me. So we see the negative, the construction of the sentence, which is very passive. Shall there be, instead of saying, shall we amend the Constitution, rather than shall there be an amendment to the Constitution. So they turn a specific into an abstraction, which is common in bad writing, is to go into the abstractions and lose sight of the specific. So the question you now ask is, shall there be an amendment to the Constitution concerning the removal? What it means is, shall we remove this exception in the Constitution? Shall we remove it? So what's your first question? What's the first question? What the effing exception? We need to know what the exception is. It doesn't tell you. So you ask, one of the things that writing tools, Andrew, and you probably know this, is when you come across a sentence you've written or somebody else of inferior talent has written, you have to ask questions of the sentence. So what is the exception here? The exception here is that the general rule in Colorado was to prohibit slavery except after the commission of a crime. So if you remove the exception, except in the commission of a crime, you're voting for slavery. And Colorado voted for slavery.
In 2016.
Yes. 2 million people voted, and half of them, more than half of them, voted for slavery. And they didn't know they'd done it. I mean, it's worse than filling in a tax form. Have you any income you shouldn't have declared and haven't declared? Well, I don't know. So the point about clear English, and there will be other examples I can give you as we'll go through, this is very, very important. What it meant when Colorado, when a criminal was before trial, he could be sent to slavery or improvident servitude, which means he could work sewing mailbags for 50 years without getting paid. That's in the Colorado Constitution now. So talk about meaningful English. When you ask a question like that, you cannot, in fact, most people can't understand that question. And honest people will never understand it because it's not meant to be understood. It's written by a sloppy...
Well, this is one of the other great powerful facts of, and signs of your book, is that it's a profoundly moral book, really, because it is demanding truth from people by insisting on clarity from them. And you also tell a heartrending story about a child that wasn't able to get insurance cover because of a single word in a long, long paragraph that was deliberately written in such an obfuscating way that nobody would have understood it. And tell us more about this case. It's grinding.
A very successful executive took out an insurance policy for health for his yet unborn children. Alas, his wife gave birth to a child with cerebral palsy, which made the muscles tighten and makes speech very difficult. But the traveller's insurance company accepted that they'd accepted a responsibility to provide treatment. So Julie, a physiotherapist, was hired, a doctor was hired, a neurologist was hired, and for 18 months treatment was given with the prognosis that by the age of 5 the child could probably walk. At this point, and this is very common in insurance, they sent in the cost cutters who arrived at the house and said, we have to remove this treatment completely. No more physical therapy, no more voice therapy, no more special positions for chairs, a bath chair, none of that. And so the father, being a well-educated executive, appealed. It went to another person, a doctor, who said that he did have a faint recollection of studying cerebral palsy 20 years ago, but in his present mood, he thinks it was undeniably not effective to treat cerebral palsy, which meant that the child was going to be condemned. So they went through the court system. The earlier courts all said Travellers was right, you can't do anything about cerebral palsy. But they did give the physical therapy. The thing they were most insistent on at Travellers was to deny speech therapy. And do you know why? Because the policy, as the judge pointed out, was diabolical. The policies committed the company to restore speech. And the insurance company said, how can we restore something that was never there? And the judge said it's diabolical, but he had to take that provision away from the cerebral palsy child because of that one word. That kind of scandalous thing runs through. Any insurance people who would like to argue with me, I suggest we meet at dawn on the front lawn, because my experience with insurance is that what matters is not what they say they're insuring, but what they're excluding from the insurance. For instance, you try and claim a policy when a ceiling has collapsed. What is the meaning of the word collapse? It's got 40 meanings. What is the meaning of the word prompt? Courts have adjudicated the meaning of the word prompt across the United States from a week to 5 years. That's prompt. Okay. So what I'm trying to say here is that every time you write a word or read a word, you have to think, what is the writer trying to say? And one of the problems we have today is the incoherence of business language, the imposition of business language, except when it's in favor of the giver of the insurance. It's a scandal. It's outrage. In fact, throughout the whole medical insurance, you hear lots of talk about this. But the most important thing that happened was that when somebody's health was insured and they were making slow progress, or at least they were maintaining their current health, they got treatment. But the policies were interpreted to mean unless you show significant improvement, you're not going to get any treatment at all. So you can't hope to maintain your present condition because it's not in the policy. The policy is to maintain, but not to improve. So I hope you get the point. Every single one of these words, which we use in circulating common parlance, has precise meanings in business and in legislation. And of course, Jack Abramoff, whom you may or may not know, is one of the leading lobbyists. He spent his time changing the language to get billions of dollars extra for the companies.
So what you're arguing is that individual words matter hugely. Do you want
Yeah,
to
let me see if I
answer
just
that?
press on through this. Now, one of the major writing faults, and I know that everybody here is probably very aware of these things, but I wanted to hammer them home. I call this an example of a predatory clause. A predatory clause is an initial clause at the beginning of the sentence here. I'm going to read it to you. Finally, because neither restructuring of insolvent sovereigns, nor recapitalization of zombie banks, nor ring-fencing of those sovereigns that are most likely solvent but vulnerable to illiquidity ambushes have been addressed decisively and completely, comma, end of preparatory clause, tight financial conditions and intensing financial austerity will contribute to a European recession in 2012 and possibly. The news is Europe is going to have a recession. But we've got all this preamble first, and this is the single commonest mistake when people write. They think of things that they haven't thought of, and they jam them in at the beginning to create a predatory clause. So you get rid of the predatory clause, because this, keeping the news to the end, we might have a recession, it's just like this. A meeting's going on, a business meeting, a lot of conversation going on, and a man standing outside realizes that something may... So he rushes in and said, I'm so sorry to interrupt the meeting. I know it's very important, and you said not to interrupt in any circumstances whatsoever, but these circumstances seem to me kind of exceptional, so I would like to intervene and say, the building's on fire! That is what the predatory clause does to language. And if you've written a predatory clause in your life, you've probably written 100. Now is the time for repentance. And God may forgive you, because I won't.
What about zombie nouns?
Let me see if there's anything else here. I want to show you this. This is a commonest fault in writing, which is trying to cram too many words into a sentence. And this is the Japanese train, and they're doing exactly what most writers and most reporters do, which is to cram the words into the sentence. And this is a real scene in Japan, but it's a real scene in thousands of offices where people are trying to squeeze in that extra word. So overcrowded sentences are probably more heinous than anything else. And one thing I'd like to show you is a very brilliant study of the evolution of the English language by a young man in Nebraska, recently widowed, and he had to occupy his time, so he counted the length of sentences through generations. And here we go. We start off with 63 words in a sentence. In 1560, 1596, it's 50 words. 1587, the average sentence is 41 words. Thomas Macaulay, average sentence 23 words. William Channing, 26 words. Ralph Waldo Emerson, 21 words. And anybody got any guess in the audience? How many words are the average today in a good writer?
10.
How many?
10.
Pretty good guess. It's for 14, but it's pretty good guess. So the shorter the sentence, of course. Now, that doesn't mean you can't write a long sentence, and I've given example after example here of loose sentences that run on for 100 or 200 words. But they're thought out, the conjunctions are clear, and the meaning is clear. But when you get sentences, which I've got in this book, I mean, that sentence I showed you on the predatory clause was 50 words long. So you've already got an overcrowded sentence, as it were.
Do you think they should come down?
Oh, yes. I write long sentences, and then I take an axe to them and say, what am I trying to say here? How can I make it more concise, more direct? And
you also say, don't you, that you can cut 50 words from every 500
you have
words
to
you
rephrase it to make it more direct in the expression. But when you go through your manuscripts or letters, and some of you may be very gifted, I'm sure the majority are, the language may be translucently, even with a long sentence. But I'm saying the average writer and the average person, and certainly all the people I've worked with, from Henry Kissinger to Norman Mailer to Richard Nixon to whoever they may be, longer sentences usually do them down because they can't control the bucking horse. So that's that. And for instance, here's an example. All the yellow marks here are wasted words in sentences. And I've marked them. You don't have to read it. It's kind of tedious. I don't want to drive you crazy by reading long stuff all the time. It is increasingly recognized that investing in girls and women not only empowers communities, but strengthens the global economy, for example, creating the conditions. And here's what it means. Girls could increase global GDP by as much as 5.4%. In this topic dinner, 3 global advocates discuss how it could be done through education, job training. 35 words against more than 100. Says the same thing. So where does this garbage come from? It comes because the idiom has tolerated excessive verbiage time and again. And so I want to just, you might have questioned this, because these are what I think are very important about writing.
Well, let's start at the top. What are greedy snakes?
Well, greedy snakes are flesh eaters, as I've just described, the microscopic creatures. And the dead and alive I've dealt with, give us the tools when we finish the job. The stir of living. Writing should be about specific. It should be about beds, baths, horses, groceries, etc. It shouldn't be about abstractions. You have to have an abstraction occasionally to sum it up a generalization. But the more specific words, the more concrete specific words in your writing, the better it goes. So the Japanese linguist, it's at the back of my book, describes how really good writing ascends the ladder. And the ladder goes from an abstraction at the top, like democracy, which is an abstraction, to a specific, which is the Iraqi finger stained purple as a vote. That's the concrete example of democracy in an example. So most thought proceeds best by mixing the specific example and the generalization. The generalization sums up all the knowledge. The specific makes it real to you. The ladder of abstraction. Predatory jaws, I've shown you, and zombies, flesh eaters, and pleonasms. We'll deal with each of them. But here's a zombie. This is a noun eating a verb. And this is so common. Let me give you a few examples. I came to the realization that zombie. Realization, I-O-N, instead of I realized. What's happened to the verb? It's running away from the noun. You've got to get back to the verb. Or we will carry out an implementation of the plan. We will implement the plan. What do you mean carry out or author? So words breed these circumlocutions, and unless you're very careful, you'll find yourself falling prey to a zombie. A zombie is not my invention. It's a New Zealand professor called Helen Sword, and I think she was quite brilliant to suggest. So here we are. Will you give me an assessment, please, of your relative earnings? Will you assess? Not give me an assessment of. You're spinning words and you're not being precise. A document, participate, transmit. Shall I transmit the document? Or would you agree to the transmit of the document by... We've got to get rid of, in writing, of all these abstractions. And there's the flesh eaters. This is of, Andrew mentioned, Zoophaga awesome. This creature exists. This creature is actually my interpretation of a flesh eater in English language. It's actually a photograph of a real Zoophaga creature in water which eats other plants. So I use it as the perfect example of that. And here's a list of flesh eaters. You can have them. I've written hundreds and hundreds of flesh eaters myself. And then you've got pleonasms, redundant and unnecessary superficiality. Now, you can use the pleonasm as a joke. Sam Goldwyn said, "The man who goes to see a psychiatrist needs his head examined." And recently, somebody on television was saying, a new survey has shown that 75% of the American people believe this, because the survey has shown one in four believes the matter. So pleonasm means repeating something which is completely unnecessary. For instance, absolute monopoly. It's either a monopoly or it's not. Absolutely unanimous. It's either unanimous or it's not. So pleonasms gather dust like the stuff under the staircase. And when you fail yourself writing a pleonasm, you've got to stop and pray.
What about digitization? Do you think that's...
Digitization is a horrible, horrible word.
Clearly.
Yeah.
But has it helped or hindered this process?
Oh, I mean, if we had world enough in time, this sounds like Andrew Marvell, I know. If we had world enough in time, dear lady, this crime is so enormous with social media. Social media is a nightmare, a cesspool, a sewer. Not only does it carry rancid, ridiculous stuff, but it's packed. I mean, there's 50 million people have just been exposed to completely meaningless Facebook, social media. And as we know, that we had the panel this morning from the Putin observers of how many 50 million Americans voted on the basis of Russian-fed social media propaganda, mainly about how evil Hillary Clinton was and how wonderful Donald Trump was. 50 million people. So digitization, to take your zombie, is, we haven't solved the problem yet. And I want to say this, if you don't mind my just rabbiting on a second. The trouble with news and journalism today, about what Donald Trump called fake news, when he's repeated some lie 50 times, they're the ones with fake news. So the trouble with it today is that the really important news gathering, the publishers, as I was editing the Times or the Sunday Times, I was responsible for every word that I published. So if I published something which was false, which I did occasionally, I was sued for libel, which was correct. And any other newspaper, the same, if you publish a falsehood, and that's what mainstream media is called today. Do you know that the Criminal Justice Act of 1930 has given immunity to all social media? They're copied across the world, originated in the United States when everybody thought the internet was going to solve all the problems. So they cannot be sued for printing lies. There's no penalty. At the same time that they're making zillions of dollars printing garbage and stuff, they're depriving mainstream media, good or bad, of the ability to send somebody to Syria to find out what's happening, because the viability of mainstream media has been destroyed. And what's happened today, the British government has done a remarkable thing, which you may not have noticed, but last Thursday, they announced that Professor Cairncross has now recommended that social media be responsible for what they publish, right? That part of the advertising revenues by which they've deprived from mainstream media shall be restored, and that hate speech and vile speech shall be more severely monitored, including the Russian penetration or Chechen penetration of British media. So the British government is the first in the world to take this initiative, and it's really important.
And continuing that political angle, you're very harsh on the way in which newspapers and other media organisations use the word credit when it comes to terrorist attacks.
I was really appalled when I was sitting at home in the United States and the Paris attack took place. And every single news medium, television, said, nobody has yet taken credit for this. What? Credit is an honorific, mean laudable, praiseworthy, credit. And when you crucify the language to give the word credit to a terrorist, you're actually destroying one of the civilized ways we live, which is the respect for language and its meaning. So if you've read Hannah Arendt, you know how easy it is. And looking at the United States, it's very easy to print lies, to utter lies. And the destruction of democracy is more implicit in the language that's used by mainstream media, everybody, credit, the word credit, and also the completely inventions of President Trump. I say that advisedly. He does one or two good things, but he cannot distinguish what's true and what's not. So the Hannah Arendt on totalitarianism is very important. I do feel very strongly about this because how are we to get... Look, let me ask you a question. What is the boiling point for water?
100 degrees.
What is the boiling... What?
100 degrees, isn't it?
Well, I changed it last week. It's 100, it's 100 now. So the whole of science is vulnerable when you can change the meaning of words. So if the boiling point of water is, let's say, 5, you're going to get killed, you're going to get scalded. So the insidious nature of the erosion of the meaning of words is exemplified by what happens if that was translated into objective scientifically.
Right. I'm about to ask you, if you'd like to ask any questions of Harry. Unless there's anything else. These are all in the book, by the way.
Oh, by the way, I wanted to show you this.
Okay.
They talk about digitization. I've got 4 examples in my book, 2 written by the man on the right, the machine, and 2 written by human beings, and it defies you to decide which is which. Okay, we don't need to go into any more of this. We've done enough.
I would like to say a couple of things before we throw it open. Do put your hand up and say who you are, and then you'll be getting a microphone. Thank you also, everybody, for... you could have gone to Alain de Botton and worried about your marriage. All the people here are, by definition, feeling confident and secure in themselves and their relationships. So congratulations to you, ladies and gentlemen. But before I say anything else, the great thing about this great man and the way in which he is helping to get us to write better, it strikes me, is that it can be done. If you read this book and you listen to what he says in it, you will become a better writer. And although not everybody writes for a living, an awful lot of people do here, but you all write something. You will write a love letter, you will write an email, you will write something that matters to you. And to make it clearer, because you've learnt about zombie nouns and predatory sentences and so on, is a fantastic thing to have happen. Now, let me see who'd like to ask Harry a question. Just put your hand up, because I can't believe it's completely comprehensive. There we go. There's a lady just there. And it's a question rather than a speech.
Yeah, quick question. Can I introduce myself? My name's Dickie Dold. I was once Andrew Roberts' maths teacher in Cranley.
In every other way, I'm sure this man was a great success in life.
So that's my introduction. However, today it's English we're talking about. And what I've noticed, I was very bad at English at school. Then I did a correspondence course. And what I've discovered, having done a lot of straw polls in all the supply teaching I've done, is that all the teachers of English have never revealed their style to their pupils formally. They might have written in the school magazine. Musicians, teachers of music, will always perform. Teachers of art will always perform. But my experience is right through to university, whether yours is different, I don't know, is that teachers of English will never show you how they write.
Okay, we're going to take that as a question. So.
I don't.
And so what
you echo so much I can't.
Oh, I see. I'm sorry.
Sorry.
I'll answer it.
So I'm just wondering whether that's your experience, that teachers of English in schools and universities never actually, they'll talk about
Yeah,
people's
that's right.
essays, but they will not reveal their own style. They won't show you an example of their own writing.
Well, it seems like a reasonable complaint to me. Some years ago, since I was listening to lectures, and the unfortunate thing that's happened is people have to listen to me, and I'm sure that complaint can be fortified. I can't see this as a solution. I tell you, I do think, however, that there's a point here, which is that teachers, so on, could pay more attention to the form of the expression as well as the expression.
Is there someone here? Gentlemen.
Would you comment, Elihu Rose, would you comment on the transmutation of words? For example, option to opt, or liaison to liaise. Both of them annoy me. Am I right or wrong?
You're right, completely right, and you should go and put battle armor and go in every day to defeat the optioneers.
Thank you, Professor Rose. Next question.
Yes, the question of parliamentary language. Sorry? Oh, so sorry. Yeah, Richard Cohen. Yes, while you might prefer for us to use the word lie because it's Anglo-Saxon and it's short and it's explicit, for Mr. Speaker would require us to use the Churchillian expression terminological inexactitude. So I'm afraid there's a reversal in that particular example.
Well, that's a euphemism. There's a whole book on euphemism, which is very, very useful when you get in trouble. You can say, I didn't mean that, and I meant you give the euphemism. It's Partridge's book of euphemism. I think it's a minor issue. I mean, when Churchill, the terminological inexactitude was a piece of wit, I thought, by Churchill, instead of saying lie, because you're not allowed to say lie. In fact, I accused Mr. Trump of having terminological exuditis.
Madam.
Thank you. Sarah Ingham. I was taught to write when I was an indentured trainee on a local paper, local weekly paper in Reading, and I'm wondering whether we should mourn the passing of the local press in this country.
Mourn the passing of the local press in this country. In fact,
I think the local press is not bad.
No, it's excellent, but it's dying out.
Huh?
But it's dying out.
Well, I know. The Oldham Chronicle, which is way up north, has just closed, I think. And the problem is the one related to the one I was talking about, which is that local media can no longer afford... I'm sorry, we're talking here about the language in local media and the news service it gives. And local media is constrained, as in fact mainstream media is, by the laws of libel, by attempting to be truthful, which social media is not. And social media is killing the local media, both in two ways. First of all, in denial of revenues, because most classified advertising now is no longer with local papers, which when I was a local newspaper editor in time immemorial, we lived on classified advertising when I was editing the Sunday Times. And that revenue stream has died out, so you can't afford to send reporters to Moscow and stay for 3 months and get the truth about Putin or whatever it may be. I find the language in local newspapers reasonably acceptable, actually. I don't find any great fault in language. And in fact, just almost as an aside, the British press, mainstream for some of its hideous excesses, is actually better written than you would expect, and better written mostly than the general run of papers in America, and the design is also better.
There's another question there, the gentleman in the middle on the left-hand side there.
My name is Hugh Shields. I actually went to college with Andrew, and I even invited him for dinner once, and he survived. I don't know if he remembers that. Anyway, we just touched on social media. we often read that the language and what is acceptable in language is driven by current usage. So, for example, I understand it's now okay to split one's infinitives because so many people do. But in the world of social media and Twitter, language is evolving into something much shorter, cruder, and different. Do you not worry about that?
Well, yes. What do you think about it? I mean,
to be honest, I'm a little bit neutral. I think this idea that the language is driven by what people do and how they use it currently has some validity to it.
Do you split your infinitives? We went to college together, remember?
No, I tell you, actually, it's probably a reasonable guess that social media messages will get better because the receptive audience will get impatient, and that generally there will be a trend over the next 2,000 years to improve. But I won't be here.
Yes, a couple of questions at the back.
The echo is difficult for me.
Yes, I'll try. Yes, I will repeat the question.
Hello, my name's Edward McLaren. I'm a sixth form schoolboy. So last year, just on the topic of social media again, the news reported on over 50 stories of mass shootings that the shooter was Sam Hyde, who's actually a comedian. So people called in, they put this man's name here to try and test if the media would simply, tell their story to be first instead of being accurate. So surely social media prevents the media from having a monopoly on truth.
That's a very important point. Clickbait, as it's called, which you're impelled to click on the social media for a catchy headline or picture or whatever it is, you're quite right. And that's the whole point. In fact, you reinforce the point. So where is the standard of truth? And every time, I'm very much in favour of intense scrutiny of mainstream press, so that one of the most important things you can do as an editor, and in my lifetime, is to correct an error. And the number of times errors are not corrected in mainstream media is bad enough. It's appallingly worse in social media because errors run through it like a river through a countryside. Vast. I mean, I stopped counting. I kept counting the number of untrue, completely fake, false stories on social media, on Facebook, on Twitter, or whatever. It's just hopeless, and it can't be solved until the responsibility for what you publish is accepted. I could go on for 3 years, but I won't.
There's another question at the back there.
I have 3 questions.
Can you ask?
Do you believe there is a lot of grammar problems, or there are a lot of grammar problems? And then my second question is, could you be a little bit more specific and less abstract about why the Anglo-Saxon language is the standard of brevity?
That's a very interesting question, actually. I'm not a linguist. I'm a practitioner of writing, but I'm not a linguist. A linguist would be better qualified to answer that. Unfortunately, some linguists lose sight of making things clear. They're much more concerned with the origins of what happened in the cave when somebody scrawled a picture of a bison. So I'm not good at that. Pinker's pretty good on language, on the origins of words and language.
Yes, I think it's very interesting also that the Anglo-Saxon words tend to be shorter. We have, of course, the great example of the 167 words in Winston Churchill's We Shall Fight Them on the Beaches paragraph, of which all but 2 words, which ends, as you can remember, we shall never surrender, and all but 2 of those words are to be found in Old English. There's one, the word confidence, which is Latin, and then, of course, the word surrender is French.
Look, you're getting good value here today. You get the voice of Winston Churchill just on Anglo-Saxon. That's terrific. No, I will read Andrew's book probably in the next 3 or 4 days, which I commend to all of you. But I think just reading Churchill's... Churchill was a journalist, don't forget. Reading Churchill's journalism is terrific. I mean, the description of him with the cavalry fights and so on. I mean, maybe occasionally he's exaggerated a little bit.
Okay.
But there's a great heritage for all English people in Winston Churchill, just as, in fact, if you look at the United States and look at Lincoln's speeches, Lincoln's are incredibly drawn from the Bible so often. Or Martin Luther King, the cadence is drawn from Martin Luther King. The memorable sentences uttered by these people, the King James is the Bible, of course, and so on and so on. So I feel really lucky to have been brought up in those word atmospherics, if that's the word.
Yeah. Was there another lady here at the front? If you could also say which part of my life you've come from.
last year's Clifton Literary Festival.
Oh, hallelujah. Well done. That's the best bit.
Many of us in this room grew up when we expected to pay for content, whether the content was a newspaper or a license for television or going to the films and paying for it, and that has all changed. And the new expectation is that all content is supposed to be free. Would you like to comment about that change in perception? And in my mind, that is where we're also seeing the death of journalism, the death of publications, and it's certainly had an incredible influence on the demise of the music industry.
I think that's true. It's true. I mean, you've probably got... I tell you what, I will make your bid. You can't refuse. Send me the examples, and I will steal them and incorporate in the next edition.
Lady at the front here.
At the risk of blurring the tone Patsy Bloom. At the risk of lowering the tone of this afternoon, how do you compare Boris Johnson's articles and English to Mr. Churchill?
Boris Johnson's English and articles, the cadences and beauties of the Johnsonian sentence. Do you want to comment on Boris Johnson's use of English?
Oh, he's good. I don't follow him on the circumlocutions of his logistics. But in the use of the English language, he's pretty good.
Yes.
I mean,
Master
he wrote a book
nuance.
on Churchill, which will, of course, be demolished by this book. But he understands language, and he's quite witty. I wish he'd...
Yeah, okay. That's quite enough. Ladies and gentlemen, we've got a few more minutes. Any more questions? Right at the back is there. Sorry, could I? Yes, there's a lady right at the back there who's going to ask a question.
I tell you what, he's 10 times better than Donald Trump.
Hello.
Oh, my God.
Hello?
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
Yes, it's Georgina Shannon. I just wondered whether your war against long sentences meant that you disapproved of Dickens.
I'm not against long sentences. I'm only against when they're incoherent. And the longer the sentence, the harder it is to maintain coherence. I've given lots of examples in here of long sentences, which are an absolute joy to read because the use of the semicolon or comma and the use of the adverbs to take us through time so we know that we're on a journey is wonderful when you get that, because there's a piece by Ian Jack here, who's a very, very brilliant writer, and he describes going to a memorial service and they're talking in the bar, and he said, this was the time to remember this and remember that and remember this, and each one of them is nicely punctuated, so you get a very, I think it's 80 or 90 words. Or take John Reed, one of the people who's not read enough today, the man who wrote 10 Days That Shook the World. His descriptions of going to war, reporting the war in Mexico, long sentences, is absolutely marvelous because he's in control. He's not let the sentence run away with himself, and he's used punctuation where it's necessary to indicate a change of pace or direction. And that, by the way, is one of the things which I was grateful to learn when I was a newspaper reporter, because my sentences ran the length of the street until, I finally learned a lesson when I got wrapped over the knuckles. He said, Jesus created, God created the world in 7 days. Why do you need 700 for your sentences?
Madam.
Hi, Harry. Sorry.
This is a writer. Okay.
Holly Peterson, everyone.
Hi, Harry. I read Stephen King's book called On Writing. I don't know if you've ever read it, but the first 10 pages is an attack on the adverb. And I wonder how you felt about adverbs. Are they lazy to walk slowly versus saunter?
I mean, the adverb that sticks in my mind is in the wartime. I keep reminding myself, is your journey really necessary? Really, adverb. Is the adverb really necessary? And I think, actually, the trouble is, the trouble with that one adverb, I think, is fine. I mean, my journey wasn't really necessary, so I got off the train. The actual emphasis of the adverb. The trouble is that if you're not careful the way we now go, it's like this. He was completely, certifiably, absolutely, totally, without any question whatsoever, I swear on my oath, telling the truth. Instead of saying, he told the truth. Now it's not, you don't believe it, it's completely and utterly true. Wait a minute, what about being true? Isn't that enough? These are pleonasms. So when you keep decorating, anybody who uses so many adverbs to say something is true is obviously a fake, and you shouldn't buy anything off him.
Right, we've got time for one more question. Gentleman at the front who survived the Blitz, we heard earlier.
Michael Brahams. Don't you think the problem lies with education? And to give an example, which will interest Andrew Roberts, I hope, when I was at school, I loved history, but I was told I had to write really flowery English like G.M. Trevelyan. Mind you, I was at a school where one master described his pew in chapel as an advantageous position for surveying the assembled multitude.
Well, the thing is, writing like Trevelyan or somebody great like that is like you, like me, or maybe you and me, going to a dude ranch in the West, and they say, which horse would you like? Well, I'd like one with real spirit, and so on. So they give you one which gets you off in 5 seconds. In other words, to write like Trevelyan, or some of the other great writers that you know, like, for instance, George Orwell, you have to have control, know what the sentences are doing. You can't write like Trevelyan if you're simply imitating the cadences of him. I mean, when you think about where Martin Luther King got his cadences from, marvelous from church and so on. And your school, I think, is doing the right. Forgive me, was doing the right thing, which is if you could get Trevelyan flowing into your veins, that would be wonderful. If you get them to flowing into the cerebrum, it would be even better.
Ladies and gentlemen, we have had a masterclass from one of the giants of our language. Now, come along and